Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: in Ukraine and Gaza, twilight for the rules-based order. Trump equates his domestic political opposition to World War II enemies abroad. A war Putin still can't win. The race gap that shapes American views of war. Relatives of hostages in Gaza endure a nightmare, but dream their loved ones will be freed. In Ukraine and Gaza, twilight for the rules-based order. Washington Post. Analysts and policymakers are starting to question whether the war in Ukraine and the current crisis in Gaza represent the civilizational fault line Western leaders claim they do. Republican lawmakers in the U.S. have stymied new funding for Ukraine's war effort in a sign of Ukraine fatigue, whilst perceived Western complicity in Palestinian suffering is hampering U.S. diplomacy. This week, at ministerial meetings for the Group of 20 Major Economies in Rio de Janeiro, Secretary of State Antony Blinken weathered complaints from his counterparts on the latest instance of the United States vetoing Security Council calls for an immediate ceasefire over Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel is already in the dock at the UN's top court over charges that it may be provoking genocide in Gaza, and this week hearings began over a separate inquiry into the legality of Israel's occupation and control over Palestinian territories. The emerging reality is that we do live in an increasingly a la carte world of waning U.S. clout, shifting alliances and the steady erosion of international law and the universal principles that undergird it. Trump equates his domestic political opposition to World War II enemies abroad. Washington Post. Donald Trump compared his political opponents to foreign enemies that the U.S. fought in World War II in a speech to the national religious broadcasters in Nashville on Thursday. Trump said the people he referred to were very sick people and called the fight against them a holy war. He also pledged to appoint a task force to review the cases of every political prisoner prosecuted by the Justice Department, a term he often uses to describe defendants charged in the January 6, 2021 riot at the U.S. Capitol. A war Putin still can't win. Foreign Affairs. As the war in Ukraine enters its third year, the situation is becoming increasingly dire for Ukraine, and Russia seems to have the upper hand, according to this article. Ukraine is facing acute shortages of munitions and manpower, doubts about continued U.S. support, and Russian forces are prepared to take advantage. However, the article argues that the West needs to recognize that this remains an incredibly difficult war for Putin to win, and one he might even lose. While Ukraine faces steep challenges, the West knows far less about the pressure Putin faces and how that might intensify if he fails to get quick results from all the investments made in the war. The way the war develops in 2024 will depend not only on how Ukraine faces its military challenges but also on how much and in what ways the West supports it. The article concludes that if the U.S. aid package for Ukraine remains delayed, it will make it harder for Ukraine to hold its lines and recast its strategy for the longer term. If the package does come through, it should make it easier for Ukraine to hold its lines and for the U.S. to reconsider its approach. The race gap that shapes American views of war. Foreign Affairs. Black Americans have historically been more skeptical of U.S. military action abroad compared to their white counterparts. However, this racial gap in support for war has not been comprehensively investigated by the field of international relations. A recent study analyzed over 60 public opinion polls on the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq and found evidence of a long-standing racial gap in support for military action. Black Americans were, on average, about 30% less likely to support the Iraq War than white Americans during the George W. Bush and Barack Obama presidencies. This racial gap in war support persists in more recent polling, with Black Americans showing less support for sending troops to defend South Korea, Taiwan, Ukraine, or other Eastern European states. The study suggests that concerns about potential American casualties play a role in Black Americans' lower support for war. Black Americans have historically borne disproportionate casualties in battle, and this history likely contributes to their casualty sensitivity. Additionally, Black Americans' attitudes toward war may be influenced by a sense of linked fate, a concern for the improvement of social and economic conditions for all members of the racial group. The study also highlights the role of political leadership in shaping attitudes toward war, with Black respondents feeling less represented by George W. Bush and exhibiting greater trust in Barack Obama. The racial gap in attitudes toward the use of military force is under-examined by policymakers and the foreign policy establishment. Understanding the concerns and narratives that drive this gap is crucial for building trust and meaningful engagement with Black intellectual leaders, veterans, and activists. Ignoring Black Americans' unease about the impact of military operations risks deepening their alienation from U.S. policies and undermining their willingness to support government policies in the future. Relatives of hostages in Gaza endure a nightmare, but dream their loved ones will be freed. Associated Press. The families of the hostages taken by Hamas during the conflict between Israel and Gaza in October 2014 are increasingly desperate for a resolution. Negotiations to secure their release have stalled, and the families are becoming concerned that both the Israeli government and the wider world are losing interest in their struggles. To date, more than 29,000 Palestinians have been killed in the conflict, and local health officials report that the majority of them have been women and children. In addition, there have been 1,200 deaths in Israel, mostly civilians. The hostages are believed to be held deep inside Hamas tunnel network in Gaza, and to date, 134 people are still being held captive. The plight of the hostages has deeply affected Israeli citizens, and the families of the hostages have launched a campaign to raise awareness of the situation and to keep the issue in the public consciousness. However, the campaign is facing increasing challenges. Most recently, negotiations to secure the release of the hostages have been hampered by the gulf between the terms of Hamas and Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is determined to continue the war until he achieves total victory, but critics argue that this is a politically motivated stance. Philippine Maoist rebels dismiss Manila's claim of ending insurgency by 2025. South China Morning Post. The military in the Philippines is continuing to engage in armed clashes with Maoist insurgents, despite government claims that the New People's Army, NPA, has been neutralized. Maoist rebels have fought government forces at least 10 times since the start of this year. While the military believes the NPA peaked during the 1980s, the rebels claim to have expanded their fighting capacity in the years since. The AFP has yet to respond to NPA's claims, but said the rebels had suffered 21 casualties since January. AP Photos. Ukraine endures a second year of war with scenes of grief, suffering and also joy. Yahoo! Associated Press photographers have documented the second year of Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion, capturing the death and destruction, as well as moments of joy, that have become commonplace during the conflict. The countryside in the eastern regions of Ukraine is now littered with splintered trees, reminiscent of World War I battlefields. Soldiers continue to battle from trenches and rely heavily on artillery. Bodies are scattered throughout ruined buildings and forests, victims of Russian barrages that repeatedly target civilian areas. The conflict has killed over 10,000 civilians and wounded nearly 20,000 others. The cost of reconstruction is expected to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Biden lawyers wrestle with lack of congressional blessing for Houthi conflict. New York Times. The United States has directed large-scale military strikes against the Iran-backed Houthi militant group in Yemen, which has disrupted shipping in the Red Sea. This has prompted the Biden administration to grapple with what actions it can take without congressional approval. The administration is wrestling with how the War Powers Resolution, a law intended to limit wars that lack congressional authorization, applies to the conflict. Additionally, the administration is deciding what to do with the 14 detainees the military has been holding for over a month. The detainees were captured when the U.S. Navy intercepted and sank their boat, which was smuggling Iranian missile components to the Houthis. The Biden administration is trying to determine the scope and limits of its power in the conflict with the Houthis, which is part of the wider regional conflagration. Why it took the U.S. 51 years to get back on the moon. Bloomberg. Houston-based company Intuitive Machines has become the first private firm to land a vehicle on the moon. The company's robotic spacecraft touched down on the lunar surface on November 11, following a $118 million mission funded by NASA. It is the first time a private company has successfully landed a vehicle intact on the moon. Previous attempts by the likes of SpaceIL, Espace and Astrobotic failed for a variety of reasons. Although NASA first put people on the moon in 1969, the challenge was much more difficult for firms with no previous experience of moonshot missions. The lunar surface presents a harsh environment, and spacecraft must deal with temperature changes and cosmic rays that can damage electronics. There is also the problem of the moon's low gravity and rough terrain. Intuitive Machines landed in the moon's South Pole region, an area that contains craters believed to contain ice. NASA hopes to land future Artemis astronauts in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, bringing you the latest news and analysis. Today, we discussed a range of topics, from the waning rules-based order in Ukraine and Gaza to Donald Trump's comparison of his political opponents to World War II enemies. We also examined the ongoing war in Ukraine, the racial gap in American views of war, the plight of hostages in Gaza, the Maoist insurgency in the Philippines, and the recent Singapore Air Show. Lastly, we explored the Biden administration's struggle with the Houthi conflict in Yemen and the historic achievement of a private company landing a vehicle on the moon. Looking at these stories, it's clear that the world is undergoing significant shifts and challenges. The traditional rules-based order is being questioned, as Western leaders struggle with fatigue and complicity in conflicts like those in Ukraine and Gaza. In the US, the political climate remains contentious, with Trump equating his domestic political opposition to enemies abroad. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine continues to escalate, with Russia seemingly having the upper hand, but the outcome remains uncertain for Putin. The racial gap in American views of war is an important and under-examined issue. Black Americans have historically been more skeptical of military action, likely due to their disproportionate casualties and concerns about linked fate. It's crucial for policymakers and the foreign policy establishment to address these concerns and engage with Black leaders and activists. In Gaza, the families of hostages endure a nightmare, desperately hoping for their loved ones to be freed. The conflict has claimed thousands of lives and negotiations for their release have stalled. The situation highlights the human cost of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza. In the Philippines, the Maoist insurgency continues, despite claims of neutralization by the government. Armed clashes between the military and Maoist rebels persist, underscoring the challenges in resolving this long-standing conflict. At the Singapore Air Show, new weapon systems made their foreign debut, but major defense deals were scarce. The absence of Russian companies due to international sanctions and the reluctance of Israeli companies to discuss the recent war with Hamas reflects the complex dynamics of the defense industry. Finally, we celebrated the historic achievement of a private company landing a vehicle on the moon. Intuitive Machine's successful mission marks a significant milestone in lunar exploration and opens up new possibilities for future missions. In conclusion, the world is facing a multitude of complex challenges, from geopolitical conflicts to racial gaps in attitudes toward war. It's essential for us to stay informed and engage in meaningful discussions to understand and address these issues. Now, I invite you, our viewers, to share your thoughts and questions. What are your ideas on the waning rules-based order and the challenges facing Ukraine and Gaza? Let's start the conversation. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.